Hello, everyone, and welcome to Genocide News Now from the Lemkin Institute. I'm your host, Molly Reagan. The Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention is an all-volunteer organization that relies on donations from individuals like you to cover operating costs. If you appreciate the clear-eyed, even-handed, and frank assessments of situations you care about, please consider making a one-time contribution or monthly gift on our website or subscribe to our podcast on Patreon. Now let's dive into the news. Our first story concerns the recent escalation of armed conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon after Israel conducted a series of coordinated attacks targeting Hezbollah militants and injuring thousands of Lebanese citizens. After an exchange of airstrikes between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel officially declared war and began ground operations in southern Lebanon on September 30th. Israeli airstrikes have killed over 1,000 Lebanese civilians in the past 2 weeks, and 1 million are internally displaced as they flee the violence. Experts fear that Israeli military operations to target Hezbollah militants will mirror those Israel has conducted to target Hamas militants in Gaza. Israel's intentional conflation of Gazan civilians with Hamas, which has resulted in the indiscriminate and genocidal targeting of Gazans, is threatening to repeat in Lebanon. Since the Israel-Hamas conflict began on October 7, 2023, Hezbollah has conducted rocket attacks on Israel in support of Gaza. In response, Israel has conducted airstrikes and assassinations in Lebanon, killing senior Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. From October 7, 2023 to September 20, 2024, Israel and Hezbollah have exchanged over 10,000 attacks, with Israel conducting over 8,000 attacks in Lebanon and killing at least 752 people. On September 17th, pagers used by hundreds of Hezbollah members exploded simultaneously across Lebanon as part of the first wave of device attacks widely attributed to have been planned and carried out by Israel. The pagers exploded wherever militants had them on their person, in homes, cars, grocery stores, and cafes. The pager explosions killed around 12 people, including 2 children, and wounded over 2,300 who happened to be nearby. On September 18th, Lebanon saw a second wave of electronic device attacks as walkie-talkies exploded in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon, including the funeral in Beirut for 3 Hezbollah members and a child. The second wave of detonations killed at least 25 people and wounded over 600. Solar energy systems also exploded in homes in Beirut and southern Lebanon. Experts believe that these device attacks were a result of Israel's supply chain interference, in which explosive devices were built into electronics before they were distributed to Hezbollah members and remotely triggered. In the wake of the deadly device attacks, Hezbollah and Israel intensified their exchange of airstrikes. Israeli airstrikes on September 23rd were some of the deadliest, with more than 650 attacks on 1,600 Hezbollah targets, resulting in 490 people killed and 1,645 people injured. Those airstrikes hit hospitals, medical centers, and ambulances, and many fled southern and eastern Lebanon towards Beirut. Many Israeli strikes have targeted Beirut's southern suburbs, where Hezbollah has a strong presence, and southern Lebanon, where Israel claims Hezbollah has converted entire communities into military bases with hidden rocket launchers. In response to the September 23rd attacks, Hezbollah launched more than 200 rockets targeting Israeli air bases in Alufa, Haifa, and Zykan Yaakov. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah was killed in an airstrike on an apartment building September 27th in Beirut. Between September 23rd and 27th, over 100,000 Lebanese civilians were displaced. On September 29th, Israeli airstrikes in Beirut, Sidon, Baalbek, Hermel, and Bekaa killed 105 people. Hezbollah continued firing rockets and missiles into Israel, targeting northern Gesher Haziv settlements, areas in Haifa, military positions in the Golan Heights, and the Kfar Giladi kibbutz. Israel began its southern invasion of Lebanon on September 30th. Hezbollah responded by launching projectiles at the Israeli military on the southern border, as well as 2 Israeli intelligence agencies in Tel Aviv. Israel continued to hit villages in southern Lebanon with airstrikes and warned Lebanese civilians to evacuate north of the Wali River, 36 miles from the southern border. On October 1st, Iran, who has been a longtime backer of Hezbollah, launched 180 missiles into Israel. Iran's participation in the conflict threatens an expansion of hostilities in an already rapidly escalating conflict which endangers hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Israel's tactics of indiscriminate attacks in Lebanon, like those carried out in Gaza, should be scrutinized under international law. Whether they be by state force like the Israeli military or non-state actors like Hezbollah militants, both are obligated under international law to adhere to the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution when launching attacks. Civilian objects that are not being used for military purposes like hospitals and schools are protected from attacks under international law. Those carrying out attacks must do everything feasible to verify that the object of the attack is not civilian in nature and to minimize loss of civilian life. Israel and Hezbollah must, to the maximum extent feasible, remove civilian populations from military targets and avoid targeting military objects in densely populated areas. Israel must not equate Hezbollah with Lebanese civilians and resort to indiscriminate bombings in their targeting of Hezbollah militants. The Lemkin Institute is very concerned with the indiscriminate attacks on civilians and the rapid escalation and expansion of the conflict. The Institute urges the international community to call for a ceasefire and promote overall de-escalation in the region. The international community must investigate violations of international law and hold those responsible to account. Our next story concerns the unrest in Venezuela in the wake of its recent presidential election. On August 22nd, the Venezuelan Supreme Court declared President Nicolas Maduro the winner of Venezuela's 2024 presidential election, held on July 28th. This decision comes amidst ongoing political unrest and mass protests due to allegations of election fraud. Mass demonstrations led by the opposition party began across the country after the Venezuelan National Electoral Council, GNN, announced Maduro as the winner on July 28th without releasing a vote breakdown of voting tallies from individual polling stations, as is the norm in Venezuela's electoral process. The opposition party refuted this claim, asserting that their candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, had actually won according to published voting tallies they had received from individual polling stations. The election was observed by the United Nations Electoral Technical Team and the Carter Center, who noted that the electoral process lacked transparency and integrity and questioned the result. Despite the CNA's claim, the Carter Center confirmed the reliability of voter tally sheets publicized by the opposition and claimed that with 81% of the votes counted, Gonzalez had won by a significant margin. However, the CNA and the Venezuelan Supreme Court continued to proclaim Maduro as the winner without disclosing evidence. Maduro continues to finalize his government with loyalists while maintaining a harsh suppression of protests and political opposition. The multi-level legitimization of Maduro and his government's systematic targeting of critics raises concerns for future polarization of Venezuelan society, the escalation of human rights abuses, the future of free and fair elections, and the perpetuation of impunity. In the wake of the claims of election fraud, anti-Maduro protests occurred across the country. The day following the election saw the highest number of protests with 86 anti-Maduro demonstrations. Demonstrations continued after the opposition party called for voters to mobilize against fraudulent results. Since July 28th, over 280 anti-government demonstrations have occurred in 121 municipalities. While these demonstrations have been peaceful, they have been met with widespread abuse from Venezuelan army and police, as well as pro-government armed groups called colectivos. Venezuelan security forces attempted to control and disperse demonstrators using barricades and tear gas. If demonstrations continued, colectivo members intimidated or attacked demonstrators with firearms. Local human rights organizations report 24 killings during the protests, consisting of 23 bystanders and 1 Venezuelan National Guardsman. These organizations implicate security forces and colectivos in the 23 bystander deaths. Security forces have detained over 2,400 people in connection with protests, including 114 children. Many of these arrests are a result of Operation Knock Knock, or Operación Tuntún, in which citizens are encouraged by Venezuelan authorities to report on those who participated in the protests or criticized the government. Those detained include political opposition leaders, journalists, and even poll workers. While the majority of those detained were protesting peacefully or simply criticizing the government, prosecutors have falsely charged these detainees with broadly defined crimes such as incitement to hatred, resistance to authority, and terrorism, which carry harsh sentences. According to local human rights groups, detainees are not allowed contact with lawyers or their families and have been denied the right to be represented by a lawyer of their choosing. The courts have also been conducting group trials, making it difficult to fairly assess and provide evidence for individual cases. Authorities have also canceled the passports of those who criticized the government, including opposition leaders and journalists, in an effort to prevent them from leaving the country. Maduro has also accused Gonzalez and the leader of the opposition party, Maria Corina Machado, of attempting a coup and falsifying documents and called for their arrest. After Maduro's government's violent response to peaceful protests, González y Machado wrote an appeal to the army and police, urging them to halt their violent suppression of protests and to stand with the Venezuelan people. Venezuelan Attorney General Tarek William Saab announced an investigation into 2 opposition leaders shortly after this appeal. Saab claimed that the 2, quote, falsely announced a winner of the presidential election other than the one proclaimed by the National Electoral Council, the only body qualified to do so, and incited, quote, police and military officials to disobey the laws. Early this September, a Venezuelan judge officially issued a warrant for the arrest of González after he refused to meet with prosecutors. On September 8th, González officially fled the country as part of a deal negotiated with the Maduro government and was granted asylum in Spain. González claimed that he was coerced by Maduro officials into officially recognizing Maduro as president by signing a letter before he was allowed to leave the country. The Lemkin Institute is deeply disturbed by the Maduro government's violent repression of its critics and multi-level complicity of judiciary and security forces in perpetuating human rights abuses. The Maduro government must release those they have unlawfully detained. Political opposition must be allowed to coexist in Venezuela without fear of reprisal, and the right of Venezuelans to peacefully protest their government should be respected. The CNA and the Venezuelan Supreme Court must stand by the Venezuelan people and ensure free and fair elections by releasing the official and impartially verified election results and enforcing said results. Many members in the international community have rejected the election results and called for the release of complete counts and impartial verification. The Lemkin Institute urges the international community to continue this pressure for free and fair elections in Venezuela and to hold the Maduro government and its security forces accountable for human rights abuses. If left unchecked, the pro-Maduro power structures in place at both the national and local levels across the judiciary and the executive branch has the potential to escalate systemic targeting of critics and political opposition to a situation of all-out politicide with impunity. Now to Bangladesh, where the wake of the recent resignation of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has caused ongoing political polarization and violence. On August 5th, Hasina officially resigned after pressure from the military and widespread anti-job quota demonstrations, which her government harshly suppressed. An interim government led by Nobel laureate Mohammad Yunus was formed to restore stability until Bangladesh can hold official elections. However, the continuing political violence targeting members of Hasina's party, the Awami League, as well as Hindus and other minorities raise cause for concern, as does the state-sanctioned violence committed against anti-quota protesters under Hasina's government. Additionally, the recent power vacuum has benefited political actors like Bangladesh's Nationalist Party, the BNP, and the Jamaat-e-Islami, JI, whose anti-incumbent politics have targeted Hasina and the Awami League. These groups also have problematic ties to anti-liberation forces who collaborated with West Pakistan during the 1971 Liberation War and their genocidal campaign during which 3 million Bengalis were killed and 200,000 women and girls were raped. As the situation develops, it is clear that the recent political instability is directly connected to the events of the 1971 genocide and its aftermath, and Bangladesh is at risk of returning to the same societal polarization and political actors which brought about the genocide. After the 1947 partition of India, Pakistan consisted of West Pakistan, today's Pakistan, and East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh. West Pakistani elites denied Bengalis government representation and sought to cleanse Bangladesh from, quote, Hindu influence, which they perceived as a threat. West Pakistan prevented Bengalis from assuming state power after the Awami League won a majority in 1970 and launched the military campaign Operation Searchlight on March 25, 1971. This escalated into a war for liberation between West Pakistan and the joint forces of India and Bangladesh from March 26 to December 16, 1971. During this time, the West Pakistani military and local Bengali militant groups imprisoned, massacred, tortured, raped, disappeared, and forcibly transferred Bengalis. The primary target was Bengali nationalists, namely the Awami League, students, intellectuals, and Bengali freedom fighters and army officers. Hindus were especially targeted. However, many Bengali Muslims in low-income areas were targeted as able-bodied men with the potential of being freedom fighters. Many Islamist political parties and groups who opposed the Awami League, such as the Muslim League and the JI, collaborated with the West Pakistan Army in their genocidal campaign. These armed volunteers were known pejoratively as Razakars. The events of the 1971 genocide and its aftermath contextualized the recent anti-quota protests and ousting of Sheikh Hasina. Hasina is the daughter daughter of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the father of the nation and leader of the 1971 Liberation War, who was assassinated in the 1975 coup. While Hasina serves as a point of political continuity, her 4-term tenure leaves a mixed legacy. Hasina has done much for development and infrastructure and established an international crimes tribunal to investigate atrocities committed during the 1971 Liberation War. However, human rights organizations accuse Hasina's government and security forces of committing human rights abuses against critics, journalists, and political opposition, including extrajudicial killings, torture, forced disappearances, and unlawful detentions. Hasina's harsh crackdown of critics continued during the recent anti-quota protest movement. On June 5th, Bangladesh's High Court reinstated the 30% job quota system for descendants of the 1971 Liberation War veterans. Students began protesting this decision, claiming that the quota favors supporters of the Awami League and demanded a merit-based system. A misinterpreted quote of Hasina's in which she used the very loaded term Razakar further galvanized protesters. On July 15th, the largely peaceful protests turned violent when members of the Bangladesh Chhatra League, the student wing of the Awami League, and police attacked student protesters in Dhaka. The government deployed the army, shut down universities, cut off internet, and imposed a nationwide curfew in an effort to crush protests. During this time, security forces used assault rifles, birdshot, rubber projectiles, tear gas, and stun grenades against protesters to break up demonstrations. The government also gave the army shoot-at-sight orders when enforcing the curfew. From July 10th through the 20th, 187 people were killed and 1,000 were arrested. By July 21st, the High Court reduced the quota to 5%. However, the protesters' demands shifted focus to the release of those unlawfully detained, an end to the curfew, and a reopening of universities. As of July 25th, 150 people, including protesters, activists, journalists, and bystanders, had been killed and 2,700 arrested. Protesters called for Hasina to step down, and on August 4th, thousands gathered in Dhaka's central square. Military and police response left 100 people dead. Amidst the chaos and instability in the wake of Hasina's resignation, violent mobs attacked Hindu communities and Awami League members. In the weeks following Hasina's departure, there were 200 reported attacks against Hindus and other religious minorities across 52 districts. Mobs vandalized, looted, and burned Hindu homes, temples, and businesses. These attacks appear to have been politically motivated, as Hindus have been associated with the Awami League. The homes and businesses of Awami League members were also attacked, resulting in the death of 29 Awami League members and their families. Mobs vandalized, looted, and burned Hasina's family home, now museum, and major Awami League offices, in addition to historical and cultural centers like the Genocide and Torture Museum, the Metropolitan Liberation War Museum, the Bangabandhu Memorial Museum, and the Indira Gandhi Cultural Center. These attacks have been met with little to no response from police, who have been on strike since Hasina's resignation. The interim government has vowed to restore law and order, stop attacks on Hindu and Awami League members, and investigate human rights abuses committed during the Hasina government crackdown. However, this is yet to be seen, and investigations into Hasina's government threaten to devolve into a method for anti-Awami League political actors like the Bangladesh National Party and the JI to further target their political opposition. The Lemkin Institute is deeply disturbed by the mob violence committed against Hindus and the Awami League members, and by the human rights abuses committed by Hasina's government. The emergence of violent actors echoing the anti-Hindu and anti-Awami League sentiment of the 1971 genocide is also cause for concern, especially when political actors with ties to Bangladesh's genocidal past are poised to benefit politically from Hasina's ousting. The interim government should de-escalate societal polarization and investigate violence committed during the Hasina government crackdown and in the wake of Hasina's resignation. These investigations must be conducted in a transparent and impartial manner as to hold those responsible accountable and not weaponize judicial proceedings in an already politically polarized environment. As Bangladesh will eventually elect a new government, de-escalation is paramount. Finally, we turn to the forcibly displaced Artsakh Armenians and the situation of other similarly displaced populations as a result of ongoing genocidal campaigns. September 19th marked 1 year since the Azerbaijani military invaded the 3,000-year-old Armenian enclave and autonomous state of Artsakh. The invasion came after a 10-month blockade imposed on Artsakh by Azerbaijan from December 2022 through September 2023. This blockade deprived Artsakh of reliable electricity, internet, and gas, as well as access to healthcare, food, and emergency services. During the invasion, the Azerbaijani military killed hundreds of Armenians and forcibly displaced the remaining 120,000 Armenians from the region. The majority of these refugees fled to neighboring Armenia. Many Artsakh officials and prisoners of war war remain illegally detained. Members of the Artsakh government who evaded arrest by Azerbaijani forces reorganized themselves as a government in exile. Azerbaijani forces then proceeded with a systematic cultural genocide of Artsakh by ransacking and destroying Armenian cultural landmarks, historical and religious sites, and cemeteries, in addition to individual Armenian homes. Azerbaijan's genocidal campaign in Artsakh goes hand in hand with Azerbaijan's genocidal campaign in Armenia, which they consider to be, quote, Western Azerbaijan. In addition to violent anti-Armenian rhetoric, Azerbaijan has pursued an expansionist agenda by laying claim to territory in the Syunik province in Armenia for a Turkish-Azeri-controlled Zangezur corridor. Azerbaijan also demands a shift in the Armenian-Azerbaijani border to favor Azerbaijan and a rewriting of the Armenian constitution. The forcible transfer of peoples is a crime against humanity and is a part of the genocidal process. After singling out victim groups based on their national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity, perpetrators may forcibly transfer these victim groups from one area as a part of the overall campaign to destroy these groups in whole or in part. This is especially true in cases of genocidal campaigns with a dimension of territorial expansion like that of Azerbaijan and Artsakh and Armenia, Russia and Ukraine, and Israel and Gaza. Victim groups are forcibly transferred from an area that perpetrators wish to annex and repurpose or resettle. As part of this process, perpetrators destroy cultural, historic, and religious sites in addition to homes, hospitals, schools, and other resources to deliberately bring about unsustainable conditions of life for the victim group and erase integral parts of the victim community. Apart from the 120,000 displaced Artsakh Armenians, 1.9 million Gazans have been displaced by the Israeli military since October 7, 2023, in addition to the over 41,000 reported killed and 95,500 injured. Over 70,000 Gazan housing units have been destroyed by the Israeli military, in addition to the many schools, hospitals, and mosques that have been bombed. Russia's genocidal campaign in Ukraine has resulted in the deaths of over 11,500 Ukrainian civilians since 2022. 3.7 million Ukrainians remain internally displaced, and 6.5 million are displaced abroad. Missile and rocket attacks have destroyed homes, businesses, and infrastructure in Ukraine. Ukrainians lack reliable access to water, heat, electricity, education, and healthcare. The Lemkin Institute is continuing to monitor these situations of forced displacement resulting from genocidal campaigns in Artsakh, Gaza, and Ukraine, and supports these vulnerable populations as they seek safety and humanitarian aid. The Institute urges the international community to pursue justice for displaced Artsakh Armenians and officially condemn the genocidal regime of the Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev. The international community must ensure that Russia, Azerbaijan, and Israel are held to account for crimes against humanity and genocide, and should take the appropriate steps to put an end to these genocidal campaigns. That's all we have time for this edition of Genocide News Now. This episode was written and produced by our editorial director, Noelle Jones, and recorded and edited by me, Molly Reagan. You can find new episodes of GNN in your feed every other Monday. To follow the Lemkin Institute's work, be sure to subscribe to us on social media. You can find us at Lemkin Institute, all one word, on Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Telegram. And for more on our work in the field of genocide prevention, visit our website at www.lemkininstitute.com.